As promised, if you have your Bibles with you, let's go back to James chapter 1. James chapter 1. And as it turns out, I accidentally said something stupid last week. Now, I typically say something stupid every day, usually a lot of stupid things. And I didn't mean to say something stupid last week, but I did. I stood right here last week, or very close, and said, next week we're going to do the rest of James chapter 1 all at one time. I really intended to do that. And in fact, I've even gone back and forth about it this morning. But as I prayed and studied this week, I decided we're not going to bog down and do, one verse for 3 weeks. I really wanted to do that on verses 2, 3, and 4 on purpose. But what we'll do, I think, with the rest of chapter 1 is you'll see today, these next sort of 5 things he says, we're going to do just quick hitters. But I didn't want to cover all 5 of them in just a few minutes. And so you'll see where we're going with this in a moment. Sometimes I remind myself, some of you who don't know me very well, one of the things I love more than anything in the world is poetry. I've always loved poetry since I was a kid. Have large volumes of it at home, all different centuries. I just think it's fantastic. I love the way they say things, I just like the language. And but my favorite poem of all time is the simplest one I've ever read. And I don't even remember who wrote it. But as soon as I read it, it became my favorite poem. And whoever it was said, I set out to write a one-line poem, and now I've gone and ruined it. And that's how I feel about this, right? I intended to do one thing, but it's not going to happen. So we're going back to James chapter 1. Still, however, we're going to be discussing trials, because that is essentially the sort of subject of James chapter 1. What we've seen so far is that the first thing that happens in verse 2 is that James tells us we are to consider the trials that we encounter a source of joy in our lives. But we're not going to be able to do that unless we consider them from the perspective of the truth. And then the truth is, verses 2 and 3, well, 2b, 3 and 4. The truth about our trials is this, that they're a blessing in that they come to prove our faith. And if we will respond to them with continued endurance, they're going to make us spiritually mature. That continued endurance will mature us spiritually. And so if you consider your trials from the perspective of truth, and you understand what the end goal is, it's a lot easier to consider those things a source of joy in your life, even if they're very, very difficult trials. But the rest of chapter 1, James gives us some sort of perspectives, I guess, maybe. Maybe some actions we can take in connection with our trials. There are 5 of them, in fact, and that's probably how we'll break this up, the rest of this study. 5 things we can sort of do as we make our way through our trials. I would call it probably, the one thing we're told to do in verses 2, 3, and 4 is to endure them. That's what we're told to do. Consider them a source of joy and endure them. But while we're enduring them, there's a lot that can be done to make that endurance a lot more palatable. And that's what we see in the rest of James chapter 1. We pick up our reading today in verse 5, where James says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. Let not that man suppose he shall receive anything from the Lord, for he is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. If you're just reading through this chapter, you might not think that is connected to everything we said about trials, but I want to show you how it's connected back in verse 4. Let patience have his perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, he's continuing an idea here, right? So this these remarks that he makes on asking for wisdom are connected to the trials that he had been previously discussing. So basically what that means is this. Wisdom is going to be paramount for you if you are going to remain joyous and submissive while continuing to endure your trials. Because that's what's commanded right in the first two verses 2, 3, 4. And I've said many times already as we've looked at these verses that your trials don't get to determine how you respond to them. You don't get to determine how you respond to them. God's already instructed us how we're to respond to them. We're to respond to them with joy by endurance. Endurance. So if you're going to do that, you're going to have the wisdom to know how to do that. In fact, I would say that it is fair to say if you aren't going to be able to continue to endure your trials without wisdom. And that's why James says you're going to have to ask for it. You're going to have to ask for it. If you are going to be able to consider your trial a source of joy and to endure it in a way that's going to perfect you, you're going to need wisdom to do that. Because as I've said many, many times, it's one thing to start out on a high note, but it's a whole other thing to stay there while these things continue. Wisdom is going to be required to continue to endure difficulty. And James says, so then what you can do is ask God for it. Now, first of all, let me talk about this. What is wisdom, right? If wisdom is going to be necessary to be able to endure trials, I need to know what wisdom is. Most of us, when we think of wisdom, probably tend to picture this some kind of a bearded old wise man that always seems to have all the answers. And that's not what wisdom is, at least from the Bible's definition. The Bible and James's original audience, the Jews that were scattered all around the Greek world at that time, they thought of wisdom in a much different way than modern Americans typically think of wisdom. To James, wisdom was a skill you could possess. In fact, the Greek word for wisdom is the word Sophia, which you've probably heard before on the Golden Girls, if nowhere else. Sophia is a word for wisdom in Greek. And that comes from the root Greek word sophos, which means skill. So according to the Bible, and you can see this from cover to cover, wisdom's a huge sort of topic in the Bible. Wisdom is a practical skill that you can possess. Many of you in here possess skills of all sorts. Many of you are good, builders and mechanics and artists of different kinds, seamstresses, and you all possess some sort of skill, so you understand what a skill is. Wisdom is a practical skill the people of God can possess. And here's what it is. I'm going to define it slowly, and I'm going to come back and say it again probably 2 or 3 more times as we go, because I want you to understand when the Bible says wisdom what it means. Wisdom is the skill of understanding that reality, and by that I mean the reality in which we live. Wisdom is the skill of understanding that reality is whatever God says it is, rather than what it appears to be. And then living that reality. Does that make any sense at all? Wisdom is the skill of you understanding that reality is whatever God says it is. It doesn't matter what the circumstances look like. It doesn't matter what other people think. Reality is whatever God says it is. And what wisdom is taking that truth and then living according to that and refusing to live any other way. Now, I know that sounds complicated, but that's what the Bible means when it says wisdom. Understanding that what God says is, and that living that, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that's the skill of wisdom. And I'm going to give you an example. Keep your place here in James chapter 1, because I'm starting to think now, about 10 minutes ago I said something else stupid, and we may not finish this today. Well, let's go all the way back to Job. I want to give you an example. I know every time anybody preaches on trials, preaches on suffering, etc., we always go to Job. And it seems cliche. There's a reason, because he's the greatest example known to man, not only of suffering, but how, well, with the exception of Jesus, I would say, obviously, of suffering and how to handle it. And Job displays excessive wisdom in his suffering, even if you've never realized that's what it was. So I want to point it out so that you'll get what wisdom is, because we can see it in Job here, okay? Let's look at Job's situation, first of all, in chapter 1, beginning in verse 13. We're going to breeze through this quickly. It says in Job chapter 1 and verse 13, there was a day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house. And a messenger appeared to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them when the Sabaeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up all of the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, verse 17, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels, took them away, killed all of the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Let me explain what just happened there in rapid succession. Job has just literally lost everything he ever had. Everything. Okay? In a moment, in one day, Job literally lost everything he had. I don't mean he lost his job and had a big savings to fall back on until something could come along. Job lost everything he had. All of a sudden, all at once. And it gets worse. Pick up our reading in verse 18. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and suddenly a gust of wind came across the wilderness, struck the 4 corners of the house. It fell on the young people. They are all dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. In the same day, Job lost everything he possessed, which was also his livelihood, not just his riches, but his riches were his livelihood. And every single one of his children were killed, all in the same day. All in the same day. You think you've had trials. Let's look at what happens in verse 20. Then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, fell to the ground, stopped. We expect that, right? If you've been in church any amount of time, you understand that's a very Jewish way, even though these weren't Jews at this time, and Job takes place much earlier. This was a very Jewish way of expressing your grief. To tear your clothes and to put ashes on your head and to fall down and to cry. And Job should express grief. He's got a lot of reason. But look at what it says at the end of verse 20. When he tore his robe and shaved his head and fell down on the ground, it says he did what? He worshiped. He worshiped. When we start reading this, I'm expecting it to say Job tore his robe and fell down, put ashes on his head, and cried out and screamed and wailed. And the dude fell down to worship. And then it says in verse 21, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there. The Lord has given and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. That's wisdom. That's wisdom. Where Job should have, in the estimation of the world, fallen down and screamed, oh no, I've lost everything. What am I going to do? I can't believe this has happened to me. What's wrong with you that you would take my children? Instead of that, Job worships and says, you know what? The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's what James means by wisdom. That's an example of what James means by, if you're going through trials, you need wisdom, ask for it. Let me tell you how this is wisdom. The perspective on Job's suffering from the outside would be, this is terrible. I can't believe this has happened to him. I don't understand how he's going to survive this. What must he have done to make God mad that God would do all this horrible stuff to him? You see, that's the perspective of the world. But what did I say wisdom was? Wisdom was the skill of understanding reality is what God says it is, not what it looks like to you or to the world around you. And see, Job had this perspective that nobody else has. Job's perspective was, okay, I've lost everything that I possessed. I've lost my livelihood as well as my riches. I have lost every one of my children. And you know what? It was the Lord's to take. Blessed be the name of the Lord. What a weird perspective, right? At least if you think about it from the way we typically think of things, the way the world thinks of stuff. Who would do that? I mean, he's not bound down here and thanking God for doing this to him. But he understands reality. Reality wasn't the circumstances that had fallen out on him. You see what I'm saying? Reality. The reality was all of these things are God's to give and all of these things are God's to take. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That's reality. The reality had nothing to do with what had happened to Job. And Job reacts wisely here because he understands reality is as God says. And I'm going to respond that way. As opposed to the way I would respond if all my reality were tied up in all of the things of the world that I've just lost. Is any of this making any sense? Because I'm really trying hard to get the definition of wisdom across. In Job chapter 2, something similar happens. Go to verse 7. And so it says here, we've skipped a lot. I understand that. You can read it later. I just want to show you what happens. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. Now this was after all of Job's other troubles. And he strikes Job with painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And in verse 8 it says, he, that is Job, took a broken piece of pottery, and he would use it to scrape himself, to scrape the boils, while he sat in a pile of ashes, which was a symbol of mourning. So now not only has Job lost everything he possessed, all of his children, now his health has been stripped. He has literally lost everything. Now, if you want to see the Bible's definition of wisdom, it happens in the next verse. Look at his wife's reaction in verse 9. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. That's how the world reacts to trials. There it is. That's her perspective. Her reality, remember what did I say? Wisdom is the skill of understanding reality is not what you see and what you get. Wisdom is the skill of understanding reality as God says. Her reality is we have nothing to live for. Reality to her was all of my stuff is gone, all of my kids are gone, and my husband is sick. If I just curse God, if you'll just curse God, he'll finally just get mad enough to kill you and all this will be over. That was her reality. That's how the world reacts to trials and suffering. How dare you do this to me? They don't grasp reality. We'll see that in just a moment. Look at what Job says to her in verse 10. You speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Should we indeed accept good from the hand of God and never accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Because he's wise. He gets it. Reality is not, my life was not tied to my sheep and my oxen and my goats and my servants. As much as I loved them, my life was not tied to my kids. It's not tied to my health. The reality is that my relationship and worship of God is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that is real. And so whatever happens to me, I have to respond from that perspective. If I respond to my difficulties from the perspective of how it affects me, I'm responding to the wrong reality. And it's unwise to do that. Job had the skill of having it figured out. He got that there were ultimately no real ties to this world that matter. I mean, they matter while we're here, and they matter in this flesh. I love my family. I can't imagine what this guy's going through. But he understood that ultimately, this is not what matters. There's a whole different reality. And I have to respond to my difficulty through that reality, through things as God says they are, instead of what it appears they are. And so Job is an example of how to respond to suffering, because he's an example, and a lot of people miss this, because he's an example of what wisdom means. That's why he responded the way he did. And if you continue to read this book, what happens for the next 35 chapters? Seriously. A bunch of his friends show up and start explaining their take on the situation, their reality, just like his wife tried to do. And he finally ends up telling him, you know what? You guys are just wrong. And even if God kills me, I will still trust him. That's wisdom. Now back to James with our example. When James says, if you lack wisdom, ask of God. What James is telling us here is, when you find yourself in difficulty, in trials of any kind, if you are not viewing those things from God's perspective and reacting to them that way, you are not enduring them wisely. And what's going to happen is if you don't endure your trials wisely, you will eventually stop enduring them, which is exactly what we were told not to do in verses 2, 3, and 4. That continued endurance, James says, will eventually produce spiritual maturity, but you're not going to be able to endure that way if you don't endure them from God's perspective, through the wisdom of God. How could Job endure so much for so long without one time ever giving in to the intense despair and hopelessness? Now, he did despair. He did become hopeless. He went through all the emotions you would expect him to. And there's nothing wrong with that. He just never gave in to that, because he remained wise as he endured these things. Job didn't understand everything about what was happening to him. He didn't understand why it had come to him. He didn't know how it would resolve itself. And that did cause him anguish, and it did cause him despair. But he understood this. Whatever is going on, things are not what they seem. And there's something here more important than my riches and my children and my health. And that's the perspective I'm going to face this from. And that's what James means when he says wisdom. No matter what the world around Job thought, he would not condescend to respond to his trials as if that's the way things were. One more time, let me define wisdom, and I think we've got time to move on and finish this up. Wisdom is the skill of understanding that reality is whatever God says it is, rather than what it appears to be. And when you can live from that perspective, from that reality, you are living wisely as the Bible defines it. Now, James knows that. And if we're going to remain joyous and submissive while continuing to endure our trials, wisdom is going to be required to do so. And James also knows a couple other things. We're going to try to do these real quick. Back to James chapter 1 and verse 5. He says, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. Here's what he's saying there. James is being nice here. Okay? If you read the book of James, most of the time, you might feel like he's not being very nice to me, because he's one of these guys that just says it. All right? But he's actually being nice here. When he says here in verse 5, if any of you lack wisdom, when you dig into the language here, the way he's used that term lacking in verse 4 and then lacking again in verse 5 back to back, James is trying to accomplish something. When you double up on a word like that for a simple explanation, it makes it stronger in the way that they wrote and thought and stuff. What James is saying here in a very nice way is not if you lack wisdom, but since you lack wisdom. The English sort of doesn't do as great a job as it's possible to do. James is being nice here. And what he's saying is, since you lack the wisdom to endure trials, you're going to have to go get it from somewhere else. You say, well now, how can James assume that I don't lack, or that I lack wisdom? Well, here's how. Because none of us possess wisdom in and of ourselves. It's not possible for us to do so. None of us possess wisdom in and of ourselves. Whatever wisdom might have existed in the children of Adam was absolutely ruined by sin. In fact, let me show you something in James. Flip one page, go to chapter 3. Here's what James says about our wisdom in his own letter, just 2 chapters later. Let's see where I want to go in verse chapter 3. Oh. Okay, let's go down. Verse 15. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, and demonic. That's a summation of human wisdom right there. Human wisdom, James says, is characterized by 3 things. It is earthly, it is sensual, and it's demonic. You know what that means? Wisdom as the Bible defines it, we don't possess it. Paul says later, or earlier, later chronologically, 1 Corinthians chapter 3, that the wisdom of this world is foolishness to God. And so what the apostles do is they make it clear we do not possess wisdom. Wisdom the way the Bible defines it, we don't have it. And that's why James says here in this verse, since you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. If wisdom is what's required to endure your trials, and you and I don't have it, we're going to have to get it from somewhere else. And the only one who possesses wisdom in and of himself is God. Book of Proverbs says it this way, chapter 2 and verse 6, the Lord is the source of wisdom. Well, that's pretty plain. From his mouth come knowledge and understanding. And so what James tells us here is, if you are going to endure your trials, you're going to have wisdom to do it. You may start off doing really, really well. But if they continue, you might start to fall off unless you have the wisdom to continue. And since you don't, you're going to have to go to God to get it. And so to summarize, to fulfill the command to remain joyous and submissive while continuing to endure our trials requires wisdom. Since only God possesses wisdom, James says, ask him for it. And that's what we see at the second part of verse 5. He will give you the wisdom you desire. He says that God gives to all liberally and without reproach. Since you lack wisdom, ask of God. He gives to everyone liberally and without reproach, and wisdom will be given to you. Notice here that James encourages us to ask God for wisdom by pointing to his character, his nature as a generous giver. God is a generous giver. He gives to everyone, whether they realize it or not. As Jesus said, the sun shines on the just and the unjust alike. God is a generous giver, and James points us here to God as a resource. What he's telling us here is, you're going to have wisdom to endure your trial. Your God is such a generous giver. If that's all you need, go ask him for it. He'll give it to you. He'll give it to you. God is by nature a giver, and his giving is characterized by his willingness to give generously to everyone. But this term gives to all, right? God gives to all. That isn't some sort of a blanket promise about God giving anything to anybody who asks, whatever they want. Keep it in the context here. The context is wisdom. He says if you ask for wisdom, verse 5, it is what will be given you because God is in general a generous giver. And so what James is doing here is he's telling us you should go to God to get the wisdom you need to face your trials because God has proven to be a generous giver. There's no reason he would hold back on that except for one. And he says that is unless you come to him in doubting. In doubting. And he describes this doubting person, verse 6, 7, 8. He says a person's like a wave tossed by the sea. He says that person, he says, has two souls. That word double-minded means two-souled in Greek. It says that he's got one foot in the world and one foot in the desire to do the will of God. The person that James is describing in verses 6, 7, and 8 isn't a person who really wants wisdom to endure a trial to end up spiritually mature. They're a person who wants God to help them get out of this mess. That's what's going on in verses 6, 7, and 8. And what most people will do, what I do, God sends a trial and tribulation, some sort of a thing into my life, right? And I find myself begging Him to remove it, rather than asking Him for the wisdom to continue to endure it to His glory in order to spiritually mature me. And that's the guy James says ain't getting anywhere. Because God has a goal here that's bigger than my goal. He had a goal in Job's life that was bigger than Job's goal. That's the reason that we need to ask for wisdom. James says, I want to remind you that God gives liberally and without reproach. That word liberally in Greek means wholehearted, unreserved giving, free from ulterior motives. That word without reproach means finding fault. When you go to God and ask for wisdom to endure your trials, He's not going to insult you. He's not going to gripe at you. He's not going to say, well, you know what got you here, don't you? He's not petty. He loves you. And He brought this thing into your life because He loves you and because He knows there's so much more. He can conform you to the image of His Son through this thing. And if you go to Him and say, you know what? I'm not going to be able to do this if you don't show me how. He's going to say, then my child, let me show you how. And that's what you're going to get. That's what you're going to get. The whole idea is you have to understand. The only way you're going to get through this is by a commitment to seeing it from God's perspective and living that reality. And that means the circumstances, the difficulties, the trial itself, that can't be the basis from which you experience this moment. You're going to have to experience it from the perspective of reality. And that is whatever God says it is. That's why Job's such an awesome example. Since you lack wisdom, ask of God. You want to endure and continue to endure your trial in such a way that it does the work it's supposed to do, spiritually matures you, and refines your faith, you're going to have to endure it. And you can't do it without the wisdom of God. But if you need that wisdom, go ask Him for it. He generously gives and is willing to pour it out on you. That's very, very encouraging news in our trials. The wisdom I need to endure it, my Father is willing to give me. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Next week we'll look at the humility needed to endure our trials in the rich and poor man's example in the next set of verses. Let's have a word of prayer and we'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you so very much. Your word is so good. It is so interesting and so full and so instructive and